We are ready to start.
I guess so. Yeah, there's just a whoa.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. May I remind you to shut off your cell phones so that...
And maybe, is your mic a little bit hot, feels like?
Could you reduce the mic volume?
All right.
Better.
Okay. Oh, that's great.
Well, thank you very much.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah. Well,
just showed up here.
His mic is more important. So thank you so much for coming.
Turn this off.
This event is sponsored by Baskerville Institute. And our institute actually is named after Howard Baskerville, the author of the book. So
Pure coincidence.
It's a sheer coincidence. And we are so happy to have Reza Aslan. He doesn't need any introduction. He's the author of major books, a bestseller, New York Times bestseller, Zealot, and No God But God, and the History of God, and now an American Martyr in Persia. So what do we want to do today? We want to have a conversation with Reza about his book, his vision, and how he came about writing about this topic. So go ahead, Reza John, and tell us about how did you decide to write about Howard Baskerville?
How did I decide to write about Howard Baskerville? First of all, thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've said this, I think so many times today that I'm kind of getting sick of saying it myself, but Salt Lake City is one of my absolute favorite cities in the country. I come here any chance that I get, and it's such a delight to be here in front of you. I'm really grateful. And also, I'm grateful for you guys to kind of come out in this post-COVID time when we're all just sort of experimenting with being outside again and near each other and having to have conversations again. So I'm absolutely grateful. Thank you. Okay, Howard Baskerville. Well, you know, it's funny. People keep asking me, when did I first hear the story of Howard Baskerville? And I don't really know the answer to that question. It's just kind of a story that I have. Seriously? Okay, this is, all right then.
It's very progressive here.
Just in case we break a sweat. It's just a story that I've kind of always known, you know? It's like, these stories that are just part of the collective consciousness. Do you know when you first heard the story of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree? Of course, unlike that story, this is true, and that's nonsense. But the thing is that I really, all I knew was the basic outlines of this story, that there was this 22-year-old Christian missionary who in 1907 went to Iran to teach and preach the gospel, and who ended up fighting in this revolution called the Constitutional Revolution, the first democratic revolution in the Middle East, and then who died. And I sort of knew that his tomb was still in the city of Tabriz where he died, that there was a bust of him in the museum there. When I was a kid growing up in Iran, there were schools and streets named after him. But when I came to America at 7 years old, 1979, at the end, post the last revolution, and nobody in America had ever heard of Howard Baskerville, and so his memory just sort of faded away. And then a few years ago, I was really thinking about, what I wanted to write about next, what my next book would be. I knew that I was done writing about religion. I joked about this earlier, but my last book, God, A Human History, was hard, and it almost killed me. And when it was done, I just thought, that's it. And then the challenge kind of came to write this story, but there was so little known about him, except for basically what I just told you. And so I took the challenge to write the book, not knowing if I could find anything else to write about him. I thought maybe I'd be writing a pamphlet. And then as I began to search, and I began to dig into the archives of the Presbyterian Historical Society. He was a Presbyterian missionary, and I began to find some material, a lot of material written about him in Persian, and some stuff in Russian. I started coming across some unpublished memoirs of his fellow missionaries, some unpublished diaries, and then sort of gradually a picture emerged of this three-dimensional character who was so much more than just these actions that he took at the end of his life. He became a real person. And then it was just really a matter of putting that real person in this incredible time and place where he lived. And it all just kind of came alive at that point. And I'm so grateful, because I really think that this is a story that needs to be told, and this is a name that I think really belongs kind of in the lexicon of the great Americans that we sort of celebrate in this country, because he was a great American.
So the story of Howard Baskerville really begins in Nebraska, South Dakota, and then as he gets older, he pursues a college degree. Tell us a little bit about his story before he went to Persia.
Right, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about his family. What made Baskerville so different from other missionaries, American missionaries? So tell us the story about his life, where he grew up, and how he went to Princeton University. So tell us that story.
He was born in North Platte, Nebraska. He was the son and grandson of Presbyterian preachers, came from a long line of Presbyterian ministers. His father traveled around a lot when he was a kid, and so he more or less grew up in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And when it came time to get a college degree, he followed in his footsteps and went to Princeton in order to study Christian ministry. But he arrived at Princeton at an auspicious time, because a year before he had arrived, Princeton had named one of its most popular professors, in fact, its most popular professor, the new university president, and that person was Woodrow Wilson. Wilson, as we now know, was a very complicated figure. On the one hand, he helped win the First World War. He basically created what we now call international law. He built the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. He is the father of globalism. On the other hand, he was a despicable, unrepentant racist, who I don't need to get too deeply involved in his racism, except to just simply say that he was a lifelong supporter of the Confederacy long after the Civil War had been done. And so the thing about Wilson, though, what made him so popular as a professor at Princeton was he would give these incredible orations about democracy and freedom being the divine will for all peoples. He had this sort of compelling vision of the world as being free, and that this was kind of God's design for human beings. And he also was very explicit about challenging, these sort of white, privileged Princeton kids to be the evangelists for democracy, to go and shape the world into a kind of American-style democratic society. And for someone like Howard Baskerville, this was a very compelling message. His junior year, he was forced under the new system that Woodrow Wilson himself enacted at Princeton, what we nowadays refer to as electives. Yeah, that's right. You can thank Woodrow Wilson for the idea of electives. He really did think. He was like, why do people just come here and study only your field? You should be forced to take other courses. And he created this concept. And Baskerville, his junior year, took 2 electives with Woodrow Wilson, one in international governance and the other in jurisprudence. And so by his senior year, he was adamant that he did not want to go back to South Dakota and just become a country preacher, like his father and his grandfather. But of course, back then, if you're a sort of middle class white kid and you want to see the world, there's really only one way to do it, and that's you become a missionary. He was a very devout Presbyterian, I should mention. He got his degree in Christian ministry. And so he applied to the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions to go and on a 3-year mission. And it's very funny because he made it very clear that he wanted to go to either China or Japan. He wrote these impassioned letters to the Robert Spear, the head of the Foreign Missions Board, where he said, I've prayed about this for a long, long time, and I'm certain God wants me in China, maybe Japan. And I don't know this for a fact, but I can't help but wonder if the reason he was so adamant about China and Japan, because he had no connections to China and Japan, is that at the time, there were these dispatches being sent home by the missionaries in China and Japan, talking about how fantastic everything was, how in China, thousands of souls are converting. They don't even have room for them anymore. And Japan is this paradise that it looks like a Far Eastern version of the British Isles, and everything is wonderful. And on the other hand, there are these dispatches that are coming from Persia, modern-day Iran, from the missionary station there. And they are about as far from the dispatches coming from China as you can imagine. I mean, Persia is the worst place on earth. The people here are awful. The solid wall of Mohammedanism is unmovable. My absolute favorite line from those dispatches is a line from Justin Perkins, who had spent decades as a missionary in Persia, and he writes, "All the sins of the Decalogue are ever present in Persia, and add to them the most abominable sin of Sodom." However, Baskerville knew, because the Presbyterian Church was actively looking for young men to go to Persia. They really wanted help in their Persian mission. So on his application, it's very funny. I was at the Presbyterian Historical Society last week, and I got a chance to see it and touch it. And where it says, "Where do you want to go?" he writes, "China or Japan." And then in very small writing with a little caret on top, he writes, in tiny print, "or Persia." And of course, that's where he gets assigned. And so he doesn't want to go. He really, really doesn't want to go, but it's this is the calling, and you're a missionary. And I mean, a lot of people in this room understand this. They say, "You're going to Persia. You're going to Persia." But he makes this really hilarious deal with the Presbyterian Church. He says, okay, I'll go to Persia, but instead of 3 years, maybe I'll go for 2, and then if I can't handle it, I will pay for my own way back home. But if I can, I'll stay for a 3rd year. And the church says, all right, and so he gets on a ship and heads for Persia.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I think at that time we did not have such air travel. We did not have these facilities. So going to Persia was not easy.
Not an
so
easy
deciding
trip.
to go to Persia is one thing, and then getting on the ship
It is
to go to
months
Persia.
and months of travel by ship and train and carriage and camel and horse. And I mean, it took him months to cross the 10,000 kilometers that would have been. So,
Wow.
Yeah, travel in those days was a big deal. And so
Do we know the travel route took place from northern Iran, from Black Sea to northern Iran to go to Azerbaijan, or did he come from the northern Iraq path?
he went through northern Iran, through Azerbaijan. We don't know his exact travel itinerary. However, I got my hands on this travel log by this man named, what's his name? Jackson, A.W. Jackson, who, for some Iran studies people here, you might be familiar with him. He is an expert on Zoroastrianism, and he, like about a year or so before, Baskerville made a similar trip, and was very clear about his itinerary. So I basically just used that itinerary when trying to figure out what Baskerville's itinerary would have been.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And then I think many people will not know what Persia was like. I mean, so we get a sense of how Baskerville went to Princeton. He took classes. But now tell us, what was Persia like? I mean, as a country, as a region, for Christians like him who arrived, and overall, what was happening in Persia or Iran at that time? This is 1907.
This is 1907.
Yeah.
So a year before, in 1906, a group of young revolutionaries, backed by business interests and the clergy, had launched a revolution. Like I said, it's now commonly referred to as the Constitutional Revolution. And the goal of this revolution was to create a constitution that would outline the basic rights and privileges of all the citizens of the country, and to have an elected parliament that would have the ability not just to pass legislation, but much more importantly, to be able to curb the unchecked authority of the Shah, the king of Iran. Iran was a autocratic monarchy. In December of 1906, the Shah signs that constitution. They already had a parliament and elections, and for a brief while, Iran becomes a constitutional monarchy. The Shah who signed that constitution is a man by the name of Muzaffar ad-Din. Signed the constitution and then died 3 days later. And the throne gets passed to his son, this 35-year-old, just SOB. But I mean, we've had some miserable people sit on that throne, but this guy, he really took the cake, by the name of Muhammad Ali. Not that Muhammad Ali. But it'll be the only name you remember. And, you know, Muhammad Ali Shah was raised to believe that the throne was his by right. He was raised to believe that God had given Persia to him as his own property. And he was incensed with his father for having signed the Constitution and allowed for that absolute authority to be curbed. And so, at first, he kind of begins to work in the background a little bit, trying to raise support for like a counter-revolutionary movement with the help of his Russian backers. But really, by the kind of beginning of 1908, he has essentially launched a war against the revolutionaries. And what began as a revolution quickly descends into a civil war between the royalists, who are loyal to the Shah, and the so-called nationalists, who are loyal to the Constitution. And the Shah, with the backing of his Russian-trained, Russian-funded, and Russian-commanded military, manages to regain control over the entirety of Iran, every city except for one, Tabriz. And Tabriz becomes the kind of last bastion of the revolution. And this is the moment when Howard Baskerville suddenly arrives in Tabriz.
Yep, so he arrived at a turmoil, and Tabriz was controlled by the revolutionaries.
Yeah.
And so Baskerville went to Iran ostensibly to teach and preach the gospel. But now tell us how he goes from preaching the gospel suddenly to joining the forces for democracy and freedom in Iran.
Well, it's a long path.
Yeah.
It takes about a year and a half, I should mention. And the story of that sort of gradual movement until he finally does join the revolutionaries headlong it's a fascinating story. But at first he's told very, very clearly that what is happening in Iran is not his business, right? The missionary school says, you're here to teach. That's your job. The West Persia mission says, you're here to preach the gospel. You are here to save souls, not lives. That is not your business. And the US government was aggressively neutral in this revolution, not because it had any kind of vested interests in Iran. It did not. At that time, the American government probably couldn't pick out Iran on a map. They had no interest in the Middle East. It belonged to Russia and the British. They hadn't turned that way yet. But because, as the internal State Department memos make clear, they believed that this revolution was foolish, that it had absolutely no possibility, no hope of succeeding, that there had never been, as in their estimation, a single successful example of a democracy in a Muslim majority country, that, quote, Islam seems to imply autocracy, and so the US government could not possibly support this revolution. And so he's constantly told that he can have nothing to do with what's happening. And he more or less obeys. He puts his head down, teaches his classes. He, by the way, I should say, falls in love with everything that he heard before he showed up turned out to be a lie. He loves the culture. He loves the people. He, goes crazy for the food, obviously. This kid is he's from Nebraska. He's been eating boiled potatoes, and he suddenly shows up, to the best, if I may say so, the best cuisine in the world. And so, he's having the time of his life. He's riding horses, he's boxing, he's playing tennis. He is slowly falling in love with the daughter of the headmaster, whose granddaughter is here in the audience, which is insane.
Yes.
Agnes, sweet Agnes Wilson. And so, he's having the time of his life. And at the same time, he is kind of walked into a history book, right? He's living a revolution. The stuff that he'd been hearing about from Woodrow Wilson, the stuff that he'd been reading about, he's now suddenly living in it. And he's the youngest missionary by far, and he's the only missionary who's not married with kids. And so he becomes friends with Persians, and he starts to hang out with them, and he starts to go to these meetings and these late night coffee shop discussions where they're talking about what kind of nation they're going to build. And again, you don't have to use your imagination too hard to understand how this 22-year-old Woodrow Wilson disciple would have felt about what's going on here. But again, as I say, he is repeatedly told, it's none of his business, it's none of his business, it's none of his business. And he more or less tries to obey that order until about 1909, when the siege of Tabriz happens.
So, as you appropriately have titled the book, An American Martyr in Persia, so he is known in Iran as a martyr, right? They refer to him as Shahid Amrikai. So his martyrdom took place in 1909 when he joined the revolutionaries. So tell us how he joined the revolutionaries. Those revolutionaries were his students, right?
Some of them were his students, some of them were the parents of his students.
Wow.
And again, he's living in this town that is really, it's the last stronghold of this revolution. And the end of 1908, the beginning of 1909, the Shah's troops are steadily making their way across the country, conquering city and province after city and province back to the crown. When they arrive at Tabriz, which is literally the last city, it's the furthest, northwest Iran. When they arrive, what they find is this revolutionary army under the command of this legendary, absolutely legendary people's commander named Sattar Khan. And this kind of multi-ethnic, multinational army that he has built with like Russians and Georgians and Turks and Armenians, and there's Jews and Christians and Baha'is and Zoroastrians, and everyone has kind of come together under this umbrella of fighting for the freedom of Iran against the Shah. And the force is just too great. The Shah tries repeatedly to conquer Tabriz, but he can't. And so by the winter of 1909, so around February or so, January, February, he changes tactics, and he decides that if he can't defeat Tabriz, he'll just starve it to death. And so he forms a blockade around the city, cuts off all food and water, and what follows is this incredibly pivotal moment in Iranian history. It's still taught in schools today. It's a very, a key moment in modern Iranian history called the Siege of Tabriz. It's a horrific humanitarian disaster. Thousands and thousands of people slowly starve to death. There are corpses on the street. It's horrifying. It's horrifying. And I guess the best way that I can describe it is that something just snaps in Baskerville, and he just cannot take it anymore. I mean, it's not as though, I want to be clear about this, it's not as though his fellow missionaries did not sympathize with the revolutionaries. They absolutely did. They wrote many, many letters back to the Foreign Mission Board, and they made it very clear who the villain in this story was, that the Shah is a tyrant and a murderous dictator, and that the revolutionaries are calling for nothing but their most basic rights. It's very clear where their sympathies were, but it's not their business. They're not there to support one side or another. They're there to preach the gospel and to save souls. And so they'll help the people, they'll feed them when they can, they'll heal them, their wounds, but that's all that they can do. And Baskerville can't handle it. He just can't. I think something psychically sort of switches off in him. And by the way, I should mention, meantime, he's teaching this course in the American Revolution to his students. So just like the hypocrisy of it all just starts to tear him apart. And in the spring of 1909, he can't bear it anymore. He stands before his students and he makes this announcement that he can't be their teacher anymore. That the only way that he knows to serve this country that he has come to love is to abandon his teaching post, to abandon his missionary duties, and to go and join the revolution. And then in this crazy, crazy moment that is like made for Hollywood, his students stand up and join him. And they all go off and they integrate into this revolutionary army. Just to kind of fast forward, as you can imagine, the church freaks out, obviously. The school is in crisis mode. Not only has one of their teachers joined the revolution, but he took students with him. And most sort of vitally, the American government freaks out. They cannot have one of their citizens fighting in a foreign revolution. And so the American Consul General at a certain point comes to Baskerville in the training grounds where they're training, and he says to him, "This is not your fight. This is not your country. These are not your people. It's time for you to pack up your things and go home." And Baskerville sort of very famously says, "The only difference between me and these people is the place of my birth. And that is not a big difference." And then he hands over his passport and gives up his American identity. Fast forwarding again, just because we're low on time, and in April of 1909, there's no more food in the city. There's just really no other choice now. It's basically die from the siege or die trying to break the siege. And so Baskerville and his students volunteer to become sort of the tip of the spear, and they try to break through the siege. It doesn't last very long. Baskerville gets shot in the heart. But his death and the humanitarian crisis becomes such an embarrassment for the Russians, not the Shah, Shah couldn't care less, for the Russians and the British, that they forced the Shah to declare a temporary ceasefire so that food and supplies and medical equipment can come into the city. The revolutionaries very cleverly use that pause in fighting to march on Tehran. And they bring the Shah down from his throne, send him into exile, reestablish the constitution, reestablish the parliament, and amongst the very first acts of the new parliament is to declare this 22-year-old American missionary to be a hero and a martyr in the cause of freedom for Iran. He's referred to as the American Lafayette.
Yes. Well, yes, it is an important pivotal moment for Iran. So I wanted to bring you now to the current period. We now have gone over 120 years since Baskerville sacrificed his life for Iranian freedom. On the 100th anniversary of Baskerville death, Iran had the Green Revolution, 2009.
Yeah, that's right.
And today, the country is on the verge of another revolution. So what is really striking is the age. You had a 22-year-old young American becoming sacrificed. Today, we have the same young population of Iran. According to some sources, the average age of Iranian arrested is 15 years old. And the average age of Iranian on the street is anywhere between 16 and 19.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit how learning about Baskerville will inform us about what is happening in Iran today. And how do you see the Iranian uprising today? How do you see that? Where is this movement going today? And I want you to give a little bit of your viewpoints on the women, because what is happening in Iran is women-led. It's led by women. Yeah. So tell us about first how we can bring Baskerville into the current period in Iran, how it would help our understanding of Iran.
Well, I mean, I think it is important to note that, these young protesters on the streets are dying for the exact same rights that Baskerville and his students died for 100 and something years ago. And while that is an incredibly depressing statement that, 100 years and we're still in the same place, I do think that what we are witnessing is unlike anything that I have ever seen, and I lived through a revolution. What we are seeing now, first and foremost, I think has to be declared a revolution. This isn't just an uprising anymore. And while it is true that it is female-led and was sparked by women, who, by the way, have always been at the forefront of every revolution in Iran, including the 1906 revolution, 53 and 79. Women have always been at the forefront of it, so that part is not surprising. What is really remarkable is the way that movement has now expanded and brought in a massive coalition of Iranians from all sides, older people, younger people, progressive people, liberals, conservatives, the pious groups and the secular groups, and that it's become a nationwide revolution, that it's not like just in 2009 where it was just sort of in the major urban centers, that we're seeing it in the majority of provinces in Iran. And what's truly extraordinary is that despite the diversity of voices that we are seeing now, the call has been absolutely unified, and that is the downfall of this repressive, illegitimate regime. And I want to be very, very clear that nothing less than the removal of this regime is going to satisfy the protesters. This regime had already lost any legitimacy that it maintained. But at this point in time, this is a regime that is utterly unreformable, that has shown itself to be incapable of the most basic function of a government, and that has responded to the call, as I say, for the most basic rights. We're not talking about anything complicated here. We are talking about the ability to have a say in the decisions that run your life. That's quite literally the most basic of basic rights. And that's what people are calling for. And I am just in awe, absolutely in awe of these young, mainly women, but just these young people in general, in the way that they are willing to sacrifice themselves and refusing to give in to any kind of compromise. They are united in an unconditional, uncompromising demand, and that is that this murderous regime must go. And, who knows? Yeah, absolutely. And I wish I could sit here and tell you, what's going to happen. I don't know. It's hard to say. But what I will say is that the revolution of 1979 started in 1977, right? It took 2 years for those revolutionaries to achieve their goal. And we're 5 weeks into this thing. It's a long, long process. Mm-hmm. But I feel more optimistic today than I think that I have ever felt since I've left Iran, since my family fled Iran, that there really is a chance for this regime to be finally consigned to the dustbin of history, which is where it belongs.
Yes, yes. I think we can conclude with a couple of comments and then open it to the audience. I think we both agree that Iran today is at a pivotal moment in history, and to learn from what happened with Baskerville and look at it is that the Iranians' desire for freedom and democracy has not only not died down, mm-hmm. It has actually accelerated.
That's right.
And so I think, do you see the Iranians outside of Iran and Iranians inside of Iran today, they have an opportunity now to be unified? You talk about how unified Iranians are. So do you think this opportunity, this pivotal moment in Iran, what kind of opportunity provides for us outside of Iran? And how should we kind of support our Iranian brothers and sisters?
Yeah. For a couple of weeks, there was unity amongst the Iranian diaspora. For mm-hmm. a couple of weeks, we all spoke with a single voice calling for the end of this regime. But it's a very fractured community. There are a lot of, political infighting. There's a lot of outside groups that have a vested interest in continuing to sow discord among the Iranian American community. There is a very, very successful, very well-funded disinformation campaign meant to smear, certain Iranians as apologists for the regime, or not, suitably revolutionary enough, or this person once said this, or this person once did that. And it has, what was 2 weeks of unity has devolved into the most grotesque infighting that I have ever been witness to, and I myself have had a pretty bad time of it. I've had a lot of threats and violence against me by people who have deliberately mischaracterized my view. It's funny. I'll make a video on Instagram, and in the video I'll say, we'll tolerate nothing more than the downfall of this regime, that it has to be removed at all costs. And then people will attack me and say, you're a regime supporter, you're a regime lobbyist. I literally just said, and so it's a sad state of affairs, because the focus right now, the energy that we have, has to be single-mindedly on the protesters in Iran. And as often happens in our community, we start spending all our time fighting each other, instead of focusing on the actual enemy, which is this regime that must go. So, you know, I don't know what to say about that. It's a pretty crappy situation, and it's depressing. I don't think it's going to stop these kids. I certainly know that, you know, this sort of infighting isn't helping the revolutionaries in Iran. They're not the ones benefiting from it, that's for sure. You can make up your own, you know, minds about who is benefiting from sowing this kind of discord. But I also think that they're going to rise above it. I really do. I have so much confidence in this generation. What I have seen is extraordinary. And as I said, for the first time, I really, really feel hopeful that, you know, we can get our country back. Yeah, I left, yeah.
Reza, thank you so much. With your support, with the support of our Iranian leaders, we are hoping to bring everybody together for the voices of Iran and the Iranian people. And I want to thank you for coming. Thank you, everybody, for coming and support. Thank you.